Carol Benneth had grown up on this ground, but she'd never expected to be the one making every decision on it. That changed the morning her father collapsed in the machine shed, one hand pressed to his chest, the ambulance ride that followed the longest 20 minutes of her life. Walter Benneth survived the heart attack. But the doctor's orders were clear. No field work, no long days in the heat, nothing that would put strain on a heart that had already told them exactly how fragile it was. So Carol did the only thing that made sense. She stepped fully into the operation she'd only ever helped run before, and the whole county watched to see if she could actually do it. Before we see what happened next, take a second to hit subscribe and join us if you enjoy stories where ordinary farmers overcome extraordinary challenges using real agricultural science, determination, and smart decisions. Every week, we bring you another story of resilience, innovation, and the land that shapes generations. Also tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's get back to Carol's story. She wasn't an outsider here. Everybody knew her name, her family, her whole life story. That was almost harder. When you're already known, people think they know exactly what you're capable of, and exactly where you'll fail. Carol's mother had been gone 6 years, but her garden wisdom hadn't gone anywhere. She used to plant marigolds and sunflowers right alongside the tomatoes and beans, swearing the bright blooms kept the worst bugs off the vegetables her family ate all winter. Carol had laughed about it as a kid. She wasn't laughing anymore. With bean leaf beetle numbers already climbing that spring and every neighbor gearing up their spray rigs, Carol pulled an old county extension bulletin from a drawer. Research on using flowering border rows to draw in ladybugs, lacewings, and other predator insects that fed on the exact pests threatening the crop. It was her mother's garden trick and real agricultural science, arriving at the same idea from two completely different directions. She planted 3 full rows of sunflowers bordering her soybean acreage that spring. From the county road, it looked like she'd decided to grow a garden instead of farming seriously. Word got around fast, the way it always does when a field looks different than every field around it. At the co-op, at church, in line at the grain elevator, the talk was the same, dressed up as concern. Carol's got sunflowers planted right through good soybean ground. Shame, with her daddy laid up and all. Somebody ought to have a word with her. Nobody said she'd lost her mind outright. They didn't need to. It lived in the sideways looks, in conversations that quieted when she walked into a room, in the particular kind of pity reserved for someone people had decided was in over her head. Carol heard most of it filtered through other people, the way bad news about yourself usually travels. She kept planting anyway. But it cost her more than she let anyone see, especially when the doubt started coming from someone closer to home than the co-op crowd. Walter Benneth wasn't cleared to walk the fields yet, but he had Carol drive him out anyway, propped against the truck door, cane in hand, refusing to just take her word for what she'd planted. He looked at the sunflower border a long time without saying anything. 40 years he'd farmed this ground the same way his own father taught him, clean rows, full acreage, nothing wasted on anything that didn't go straight to the elevator. "You planted flowers in a soybean field," he finally said. "It wasn't really a question. I planted a border that's supposed to bring in the bugs that eat the bugs that are about to wreck our beans," Carol said. "Mom did the same thing in her garden. I just did the math on it." Walter didn't answer that right away. He just stared out at the field like he was trying to see what she saw in it, and couldn't quite manage it yet. Linda Breck had been Carol's best friend since they were girls trading Kool-Aid stands on the same gravel road. That's what made it hurt worse than anything the co-op crowd said. "Carol, everybody's spraying," Linda told her, spray schedule clipboard in hand, worry plain on her face. "Beetle numbers are already bad. You're betting your whole season on flowers doing a chemicals job." "I'm betting on not needing the chemical in the first place," Carol said. Linda didn't say anything else that day. But at the county extension meeting 2 weeks later, in front of half the farmers Carol had known her whole life, Linda said it louder, not cruel, just scared, and scared people say things loud. Somebody should tell her this isn't the year to experiment. Not with her dad's health on the line too. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone's thinking the same unkind thought and nobody wants to be first to say it. Carol sat with her hands folded so tight her knuckles went pale, and said nothing back. If you've ever had the people closest to you be the ones who doubted you loudest, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because Carol was about to prove something to that entire room, and I don't think you'll want to miss it. Subscribe now so you're here when it happens. The pressure to spray didn't let up after that meeting. If anything, it got louder. Every truck that passed her field seemed to slow down a little longer than it needed to. Carol checked her fields daily instead of weekly. Walking the sunflower borders and counting what she found there. Ladybugs, lacewings, the beginnings of a predator population her mother's old garden trick had promised her would show up eventually. She wasn't naive about the risk. A bad beetle year could genuinely wreck her family's season, on top of everything else they were already carrying. But every time she thought about giving in and spraying like everyone else, she thought about her mother kneeling in that garden, and about the math in that extension bulletin that had nothing sentimental about it at all. She held the line. She didn't tell anyone how many nights that decision cost her sleep. Some nights, Carol sat on the back porch steps with her mother's old garden trowel in her hands, the one small thing she'd kept from that garden after it was plowed under years ago. Her mother had never called it science. She'd called it just something that worked, passed down from her own mother before her, tested over decades of tomatoes and beans that came in healthy while the neighbors fought the same bugs every summer with harsher chemicals each year. Carol used to think that kind of knowledge was quaint, nice, but not something you'd actually build a real farm decision around. She understood it differently now. Sometimes the people closest to the ground figure things out generations before the research catches up to explain why it worked. She held that trowel a long time most nights that summer. It didn't make the doubt from the county disappear. It just reminded her whose instincts she was actually trusting, and why. By midsummer, bean leaf beetle numbers spiked harder than the county had seen in years. Neighboring fields, sprayed on a tight aggressive schedule, showed damage anyway. Chewed leaves, stressed plants, farmers doubling their chemical applications just to hold steady. Carol's fields showed beetle activity too. Nobody's soybean acreage was immune that year. But something was different at the edges, where the sunflowers stood tall and thick with activity, not just beetles, but the predator insects that had been quietly building a population there all season. Linda's own fields, sprayed heavily and repeatedly, were struggling worse than most. She drove past Carol's place more than once that month, slowing down at the fence line, saying nothing, her worry for her own crop plain on her face even from a distance. Carol didn't gloat. She just kept walking her rows every morning, counting, waiting to see if her math actually held. The friendship cracked open fully at the feed store, of all places, over something small that wasn't really about feed at all. "You could still spray now," Linda said. "It's not too late to fix this before it gets worse." "There's nothing to fix, Linda. My fields are holding. Your dad's health can't take a bad season, Carol. Neither can mine, if I'm honest. I'm scared for both of us, and you won't even hear it." "I hear it every single day," Carol said, quieter now. "I just don't agree with what you think I should do about it." They didn't speak for almost 3 weeks after that. Two women who'd known each other their whole lives, standing on opposite sides of the same fear, neither one able to make the other see it her way. Some rifts aren't about who's right. They're about how scared two people are, and how differently that fear makes them act. There was one night, deep into that beetle summer, when Carol sat at the kitchen table long after her father had gone to bed and let herself feel the full weight of what she was risking. Her father's health. Her family's whole season. A friendship that had survived 25 years now hanging by a thread over 3 rows of sunflowers. What if her mother's old garden trick simply didn't scale up to real acreage the way she'd convinced herself it would? She almost called the co-op the next morning to order the same spray everyone else was using. She had the number half dialed before she set the phone back down. She thought about her mother's garden instead. Decades of proof nobody had ever needed a research paper to believe. She thought about the ladybugs she'd counted with her own eyes just that week. She hung up the idea of calling, and went back out to walk her rows one more morning, same as always. The beetle pressure peaked hard in late summer, county-wide. Fields that had been sprayed 3, 4, 5 times that season were still losing ground, leaves stripped, yields projected down sharply, farmers spending money they didn't have on chemicals that seemed to work less each time they used them. Nobody understood yet why the spraying seemed to be making things worse instead of better. The predator insects that would normally have kept beetle numbers in check had been wiped out right alongside the pests. Over and over, until there was nothing left in those fields to fight the beetles except more chemicals. Chemicals the beetles were slowly learning to survive. Carol's fields took damage too. That much was true, and she never pretended otherwise. But walking her rows that week, she could still see the predator insects working the sunflower borders, still seeming to hold some kind of line the rest of the county had lost entirely. Word of the unusual difference at the Benneth farm reached the county extension office. And Marian Ellis drove out herself to see it firsthand, sweep net and data sheets in hand. She walked both types of ground that day. Carol's sunflower-bordered acreage, and for comparison, a heavily sprayed neighboring field with Linda's reluctant permission. She counted insects methodically in both, said very little while she worked, the way people do when they're gathering evidence instead of forming opinions early. I'll need to run the actual numbers before I say anything for certain, Marian told Carol at the end of the day. But I've walked a lot of damaged soybean ground this summer, and I haven't seen predator insect populations holding like this anywhere else in the county. Carol didn't ask her to say more than that. She'd learned already that her own word wasn't what was going to change anyone's mind. Marian's data sheets would. Marian's report came back within the week, presented plainly at the next county extension meeting, the same room where Linda had voiced her doubt in front of everyone months before. The heavily sprayed fields across the county showed a documented pattern. Repeated insecticide use had wiped out natural predator populations alongside the pests, and the surviving beetles were showing signs of resistance to the chemicals being used against them season after season. Damage in those fields was among the worst the county extension office had recorded in years. Carol's sunflower-bordered acreage showed measurably lower beetle damage and a predator insect population several times denser than anything else Marian had sampled that summer. The numbers weren't close. Marian said so plainly, without ceremony, the same way she'd have reported any other set of field data. The room that had quietly doubted Carol all season sat with that report a long moment before anyone said a word. Linda found Carol in the parking lot afterward, hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets. The old friendship bracelet still visible at her wrist. "I pushed you so hard," Linda said. "I was so scared for you, and for me, that I couldn't even hear what you were actually saying." "You were scared for people you love," Carol said. "That's not something I was ever going to hold against you." "I want to understand what you did," Linda said. "Really understand it. Not just believe the report. I want you to show me." That request cost Linda more than any apology could have, and Carol understood exactly what it meant coming from her. She nodded, reached out, and for the first time in nearly a month, the two of them hugged like the last 3 weeks of silence had never happened at all. Walter walked out to the sunflower border himself the following week, cane in hand but steadier now, months further into his recovery. He stood at the edge of the field a long time, same as he had that first day, but his face held something different this time. 40 years I farmed this ground my father's way, he said. Never once thought to ask if your grandmother's garden had already answered a question I didn't know I was still asking. Mom always said you were stubborn, Carol said, allowing herself the smallest smile. She wasn't wrong. Walter reached out and touched one of the sunflower stalks, rough fingers against the thick stem, something like respect settling into his expression. Next spring, I want you to show me how you do this on the North 42. Carol didn't say I told you so. She'd earned the right to, same as anyone would have. She just nodded, and let her father's request sit exactly as heavy and as good as it was. By harvest, the story had traveled the same roads the mockery once had. But it sounded different now. Neighbors who'd laughed at the co-op started stopping by the fence line instead, asking careful questions about sunflower spacing and which extension bulletin she'd pulled her numbers from. Carol answered every question she got. She didn't pretend the doubt from earlier that summer had never happened, and she didn't let the vindication erase how much it had cost her either. Both things were true at once. She'd been doubted by people who loved her, and she was the one they came to for answers now. If you've ever had someone come around to your way of thinking after doubting you first, I want to hear that story in the comments. And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because Farm Route Chronicles is full of stories exactly like Carol's, people who trusted what they knew, even when the people closest to them couldn't see it yet. Carol stood in the field the following spring, planting sunflower borders again, this time alongside a section on her father's North 40, exactly as he'd asked. She still kept her mother's old trowel in the truck's glove box. Linda came by most weekends now, no clipboard, no spray schedule, just coffee and conversation the way it used to be before that beetle summer tested both of them harder than either had expected. The county didn't change everything overnight. But at the extension meetings now, when Carol spoke, people listened the first time instead of the third. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything her mother's garden had ever promised her it could be. Everything Carol did in this story is grounded in a real, documented agricultural practice, using sunflowers as an insectary border crop alongside soybeans. Here's what's actually happening in the field. Sunflowers attract and support natural predator insects, ladybugs, lacewings, and parasitic wasps that feed on common soybean pests, providing a form of biological pest control that doesn't rely on chemical inputs. Research on legume oilseed intercropping, including soybean-sunflower pairings, has documented real yield and pest management benefits compared to monoculture fields. The pesticide side of this story is real too. Repeated, heavy insecticide use can wipe out the same natural predator populations that would otherwise keep pest numbers in check, and over time, surviving pest populations can develop resistance to the chemicals used against them. A well-documented problem sometimes called the pesticide treadmill. Carol's sunflower border worked by protecting the natural system already capable of doing the job, instead of fighting the pest problem with a tool that quietly made itself less effective every season it was used.